Let's do a little bit of cleanup. We gotta get rid of this my middleware here. Not necessary for us to need it anymore. And then we'll open up our index.js, which has our routes file, and we'll take out that middleware. We're going to be using a lot more middleware in this course, but for now, our main route will only get our store controller homepage. Now, let's talk about models. Models are where our data is going to be stored. And before we can actually create a piece of data, we're going to be able to create stores. Before we can create a piece of data, we need to sort of describe what that data will look like ahead of time. The simplest way that I can put it is if you were making a spreadsheet, what would you do ahead of time is you would start to create all of the column headings for the different data that you expect to have. Now, a model can go a little bit further in terms of telling what type of data it expects, whether it's a string or an array. It can do a little bit of cleanup before the data is saved. It can do things like creating a slug. We're going to be looking into all of that, and that's how we do it. Now, before we get into this, I just want to say MongoDB can be what's called a loose database, meaning that you do not need to specify what your data will look like ahead of time. Sort of like if you have a JavaScript object and you don't need to specify what the properties on that object are, you just go ahead and start using them. However, by default, out of the box, MongoDB is strict in terms of it will only allow you to save data that it knows about beforehand. And that's the way that I like to keep it, because if you sort of just start going willy-nilly adding data wherever it is that you'd like, it's sort of like if you had an object and you just started going willy-nilly adding data to your object, it can get out of hand really quickly and leads to some headaches down the road once you start trying to scale your application. So we're going to be doing everything in strict mode, which means that you need to define your schema beforehand. So let's go ahead and go to our models folder, and we are going to create a new model called store.js, capital S on that. And in that model, we're going to need a couple things. First, we're going to need a package called Mongoose. So MongoDB is our database, and Mongoose is the package that we use to interface, because MongoDB can be used with any language, whether you're doing Python or Ruby or PHP. And one of the popular ways to interface with MongoDB in Node is with the Mongoose package. Const mongoose equals require the Mongoose package. Next, we also need to tell Mongoose that the promise to use is the global.promise. And what does that mean there? When we get into querying our database, there's a couple of ways that we can wait for our data to come back from the database, because it happens asynchronously. You can use the built-in callbacks. You can use a external library, promise library like Bluebird, or what we're going to be doing, because we're going to be learning about something called async await, is that we are using the built-in ES6 promise. So we essentially set the Mongoose promise property to be global, which is sort of like the window in the browser. That's our global variable, and it accesses the capital P promise. That's like if you were to open up your DevTools here and type in promise, you'll see that you get the native promise. That's exactly what we're doing here. Now that global, don't ever put stuff on it. It's tempting just to put everything on the global as you have on the window, but it's generally not what you want. Finally, we need a library called slugs. So const slug equals require slugs. Make sure you have an S on there. What that's going to do is it's going to allow us to make URL friendly names for our slug, sort of like if you've ever used a WordPress permalink. Now we need to go ahead and make our schema. So we will make it store schema is equal to new mongoose.schema. We pass that an object, and then before we even specify any of the properties on our schema, we'll go ahead and export that sucker. Now, previously we did export dot whatever it is that we wanted is equal to a function. Now, if the main thing that you're exporting from a file is going to be importable, then you can put it on module.exports equals. So you see here, we just say, here we do module exports because it's the main thing that we're exporting. But if we open up our store controller, you notice that we're just exporting properties on the export variable. And the difference between that is not a huge thing, but it all boils down to when you import a package, is the main thing that you import from it going to be a function, or are you just importing an object that has many properties on it? Or they can also be both. So we'll go more into that. You'll see more examples, but that's why it's module.exports. And we'll say mongoose.module.exports. model, and we're going to name that model capital S store, and we're going to give it our schema, which again will describe what our data looks like. Good. Now we can go ahead and start putting all of our properties. So the first thing we're going to have a name. We're going to have a slug. We are going to have a description, and we are going to have tags. The name is going to be a string. So we could just type string here, and that will know that when it saves it to the database, it will be saved as a string. However, there's a couple other things that we need to pass along here. So rather than just passing string, you can also pass it an object, which has all of our properties on it. So the type is going to be a string. And we can also specify different properties like trim, and that's going to be set to true. So if somebody tries to pass in a name where it has like a store name here, what it will automatically do before it saves it is it's going to take out the white space on either end. So my general rule of thumb is do all of your data normalization as close to the model as possible. So if the model has a property built in that will trim it, do it on the model rather than having to do it right before you save it and do any validation. So we'll say trim is true, and it's also required. So we can say required true. However, if you try to save a store without a name, it's going to give us some like ugly MongoDB error message, which isn't very user friendly. So rather than passing it true, a Boolean, we can pass it an error message, which will act as true, as well as give us the error if someone doesn't pass it. So we'll say, please enter a store name. Good. So that's it. The slug, what will the slug be? Slug will just be a string. So no, not necessary to do an object here because it's just a string. The description is going to be a string as well. So we'll say type is a string, and we'll also trim it to be true. And our tags is going to be an array of strings. So what we do there is we pass it an array here, and we say it will be an array of strings. And that means we will pass it multiple strings sometimes because there's going to be multiple tags, and each one of them will be put inside of an array like that. So we give that a save, and we need to now kickstart this model and make MongoDB known about it. Oh, I got a red error here. Make sure you put a comma right there. So how do we make MongoDB know about this actual model? Because we've created the model here. However, we haven't imported it into our application anywhere. Well, we'll go into our start.js. We'll go to right where it says ready, let's go. And we are going to import all of our models. So say import all our models. And importing our models, you only have to do it once, because as soon as you connect to MongoDB and as soon as you import your models, MongoDB will know about them throughout your entire application. It's using a concept in Node called a singleton, which means that once you configure it, you don't have to keep doing it in every single file, because that would be a bit of a pain to have to import our models and connect to the database at the top of every single file. So we're simply just going to require our models folder, and this one's called store.js. Again, you don't need to put the .js on the end. It is assumed. So we'll come back to that and import the rest of our models as we have it running. Just to make sure that everything is running fine, let's go back to our localhost and refresh. I got an error here. Let's open it up. String is not defined. Let's go back to our store here. You're probably yelling at me, oh, silly Wes. Capital S string. There we go. Refresh the page, and you should see your hi pop up on the page. That's how you know nothing has gone wrong while we created this. If we take a look at our data here, name, slug, description, and tags, we're going to be supplying with the name, the description, and the tags. However, the slug is going to be auto-generated whenever somebody saves. What we use for that is a pre-save hook in MongoDB, meaning that before somebody saves a store, we are going to auto-generate this slug field so that they can be passed in. So the way we do that is we take our store schema and we pre-save. So before it is saved, we are going to run a function which gives us a next value. So this has to be a proper function, not an arrow here. And the reason why is because we need this. What is this going to be equal to? This will be equal to the store that we are trying to save. So we will say this.slug equals slug this.name. And what that will do is it will take the name that you passed it, run it through our slug package that we imported at the top here, and set the slug property to be whatever the output of the slug is. Once we're done that, we call next, this is sort of like a middleware as well, where you set the slug property and then you move along, which will allow us to save. Remember, we're doing this before the save, so the save will not happen until we're done whatever work it is that we're trying to do inside of this function. Now, that will happen every single time that we save a store, which is not what we need. We only need to run this function when the name has been changed. So we'll go up here. We'll say if bang this dot is modified name. So we want to say if the store's name is not modified, then we just want to call next, skip it, and return, which will stop this function from running. Sometimes you'll see people say return next in one line. That's totally fine as well. I'm just doing it for explicity's sake, to be explicit. So we have our next, we have our return. If the name is not, we're going to skip it. Otherwise, we're going to set the slug to be the slug of this.name and call next. Now, that is going to be okay for now, but we're going to come back and do a little bit more advanced version in the future, because if two people have a store named Tim Hortons, then you're going to have overlapping slugs and you can't have that. So we'll come back and maybe we'll say to do make more resilient so slugs are unique, and we'll check there. So we could do unique 1, unique 2, unique 3, depending on if that slug already exists. Good. Let's give it a quick refresh. No errors. I'm happy. Let's move on to actually saving some data.